Hello, everyone. Welcome again to the Blue Boar Tavern, brought to you by the Shakespeare-Oxford Fellowship. Welcome to all our loyal live viewers who are usually here every week. I'm Jonathan, your bartender. Our guests will be joining us, or our regulars, Dorothea, Alex, Phoebe, Bonner. And no guests this week, just the usual group of us chatting about something a little different than we've done in the recent past. But while we're waiting for them, let me again just thank you so much for being here, being a supportive follower of the Blue Boar and the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship. I know people join from all over the world here, so chat amongst yourselves by clicking your chat button at your table. Also to all our future YouTube viewers who will be watching us in recorded format, please like and subscribe. It helps spread the word. These videos have become really popular. Often they come up first when you search on something on the authorship on YouTube. So very good. There's our Dorothea right there.
Hey, good evening. Good
Hello.
evening.
Yeah, I'm just welcoming everybody here. All our usuals are signing in, saying hello from Oregon, Seattle, Germany, Canada. We love you guys. So,
Honor.
Bonner,
Up there,
welcome,
everyone.
welcome. And I think Phoebe and Alex will be here soon. They're out parking their cars or finding, putting coins in the machine or something. There they are. Hello. Hello, Phoebe.
Yo,
It's Alex.
Phoebe, hey.
It's just us this week. And I was just telling our gang coming in here that we're going to do something a bit different. In recent weeks or months, we've gone to very specific things on the authorship related to Edward de Vere's music and certain plays, Love's Labour's Lost. But I think this is something I'm especially interested in. It's nice to pull back and just sort of take an overview of the Shakespeare authorship question in general and how we're doing in the world, and any strategies we might have, and share, like when people bring up stupid questions, how do you respond to them, or certain things. And we're going to do that this week. One we've all agreed on is this aggravating question that comes up so often is, well, what does it matter who wrote them as long as we have them? And I'm sure we've all heard that. So I'm hoping, in our comments, people can suggest to us, share strategies on how they respond to this when it comes up in your life. I know, Phoebe, you've got your videos and on YouTube, and comments come up like that because I've scanned down. It's something we have to deal with all the time. So we're just going to open it up. And why does it matter who wrote the works of Shakespeare as long as we have them?
Well, I think, it goes right to the heart of why it stirs so much debate. Yeah. People get very emotional about this question.
Yeah.
They do. I guess I'll just kind of throw some chum in the water. I mean, I'm really excited for this conversation with all of you, even just as we were sort of like preparing to come online together. I think, there's many threads of kind of where we are as a culture in terms of what is the canon, like how many people even growing up today have an exposure and understanding of what Shakespeare is, how many people, we live in a really small corner of the world where it's, the Shakespeare authorship question is this hotly debated, contentious topic, but I'm astonished all the time. Like, I guess this is what I'll share from my personal life. I think this speaks to this idea of like simultaneously kind of like the global village, and also this idea that like, I know we don't exist in the same cultural fabric together anymore. I never know the response that I'm going to get ever. I'm always completely astonished whenever I tell somebody that I'm interested or involved with the Shakespeare authorship question. It is such a range, and I can never predict it, from people being like, what is that? Or somebody who is like intensely negative as they hear about it, or somebody who just an anecdote. I went to see, I live in Northern California, and I went to see like a Shakespeare production in the fall, and I talked to, an older gentleman who runs this little Shakespeare company up, and I was like, my friend was like kind of goading me, like, go ask him. And I was like, oh, he's probably a Stratfordian, he'll probably be offended. I would have pegged him as like exactly the type of person, sort of like an older person who runs a Shakespeare company in like the small town. And then I went and then I was like, so yeah, do you have an opinion on the Shakespeare authorship question? And he's like, Henry Neville, no question. And so like, I was like, you never know. And then I'll meet people in bars or just out in social settings. And like, I'll be very nervous about bringing it up because I don't want to offend them, or I'll think that they're going to be really receptive and they're negative, or they've heard vague things. Like, it's almost the hardest thing for me to know how to attack people's like general kind of ignorance in a targeted way, is that it's so hard to predict where people are starting from, whether they literally don't even know what Shakespeare is, or like, I'm just bewildered all the time. And I think maybe that speaks to the answer of why does it matter? Because we are in this kind of existential crisis on a civilizational societal level where I don't think most people have even read Shakespeare. I don't think people have, we're not connected to one another as a social fabric, and we're not connected to our pasts and these like kind of masterpieces. So for me, it's this kind of disorienting experience of being very refracted and confused.
I think I've had the exact opposite, and maybe, and actually I've been very surprised because I also don't raise it. It's not what I lead with, although it absorbs a lot of my waking hours. But I've been surprised how many people say, I've heard about that. I've heard that, and it kind of makes some sense, or I've heard that, but I don't believe it, or I've heard that, tell me more. So what I've been surprised as is how many people are mildly curious, I guess is the way I would fairly try to characterize it. And every once in a while, something will come through people, writing me on my website or through my Instagram where they're like, yes. And then they go through this whole diatribe about why it's not the man from Stratford, but it is de Vere. So I've had the experience of running across these closet Oxfordians that I have known for decades, but never realized we shared the same opinion. So maybe you're braver and you just take a more
I'm not. I'm a big coward.
I do.
I talk a really big game and I'm always very hesitant. I never want to like get into a mix. I think I rambled on and on, but I think basically in a nutshell, I feel like I'm living in the Tower of Babel, and then somehow the Shakespeare authorship question and getting through the kind of penetrating through the veil of mystery and confusion and really bringing these works and what they mean and what they stood for into focus represents, to me personally, like why it matters to me is this idea that we can, I don't know, there's something healing about it. That's, I think, my angle.
I think that's what's interesting to me is that like Dorothea, I run into people who say, oh, yeah, I think I've heard about that. So you go, there's a lot of people out there who could be reached on this.
Well, the question is,
how do we do that?
What's the fuss about? I mean, it was Alex's idea to name this episode Much Ado about something. And I characterize it as why the debate? And some people, I think, care a lot about historical truth. They want to make sure they understand the real context in which the plays were written, who was responding to what in their world. It would change how you interpret the play. So there's an interpretation of the works interest for some people. If someone had an intimate experience with the court and the individuals at the highest level of Elizabethan government, the plays mean an entirely different thing than if they were written by somebody whose world is that of a small country market town. You've got themes of class, you've got disguise, you've got exile, you've got the views of women. All of that changes depending on who you think the author is. The whole history of English literature changes depending on who you think the author is. And that's why I think in a university setting, professors are so reluctant to raise it.
Yeah.
My thing is, well, English departments are dwindling, and they're not really the English department that I knew when I was in college, which is almost 100 years ago, not quite. But to me, it's, boy, if you want to get people excited and engaged in a classroom, raise this topic genuinely and see what.
Well, I'd like to speak briefly in favor of it doesn't matter.
Okay.
Only brief,
Take
only
the other
briefly,
side,
though.
Alex. You go.
I was just thinking, well, are we better off having the Shakespeare works in existence than if they'd never existed? And I think the answer to that question is yes. And so even asking the question, why does it matter, is a tribute to an acknowledgement of the quality of the work, is that even knowing nothing about the author or the circumstances under which the works were written, even knowing nothing about that, you can still appreciate particularly the greater plays like Lear and Hamlet and Romeo and Juliet. You can appreciate them as works of literature, as well-crafted works that have helped advance the English language, et cetera, et cetera. And you can say the same thing if you know nothing about art, that is the visual arts, and you see a great painting. I mean, you can draw your own conclusion, say, yeah, that's a really good painting, even if you know nothing about the techniques or nothing about the artist. Same with music. If you hear a fine symphony or even a fine piece of pop music, you can appreciate it as a good song or a good piece of music, and that's a tribute to how well crafted it is and the fact that it has a certain quality of timelessness about it. So there's a little bit of worth in acknowledging that it doesn't matter because it says how good the works are. However, as Dorothea just said, your appreciation is almost certainly going to be broadened and deepened if you do know something about the creator of the work. And that, we were just talking before we went on, runs directly counter to one of the current schools of thought in literary criticism. Is that the new historicism, or is that whatever it is that says you only look at the text? Which has arisen kind of in the 20th century and says the author doesn't matter, the author's intention don't matter, all you have is the words on the page. Personally, I think that's ridiculous because people create art, not just write. They write, they paint, they make music based on their own personality.
You can't be someone other than who you are.
Yes, and the great artists put themselves into the work.
You can imagine, but if you are growing up in 18th century Vienna and you happen to be a musical genius with a father who makes you practice endless hours, you can't escape being that person who then, becomes Mozart and writes incredible operas and chamber music and dies an impoverished life. But you are who you are. And considering in literature, right now in modern literature, particularly novels, there's a big fuss that, there's certain cultures that, you got to be careful that you're not from that culture. You're not writing about it without bringing somebody in who knows that culture, who can help you to make sure you're not making any mistakes. Well, the issue about who wrote the works of Shakespeare, whether they come from someone from a small market town or whether they come from somebody who had an extraordinary education and knew everyone in the upper levels of English government, I mean, it's as wide a gulf as you can imagine, right?
Yeah. I have you inspired thoughts in me, Alex, but I want to give Bonner a chance because I see you putting your glasses on, so I can tell you.
Oh, okay.
Ready to.
We're getting some good comments from our listeners, and so it's fun to get there. But one of the things about the Shakespeare plays, and I tell people this, and I don't know that it means that much to them because most people, they have a little bit of interest. The Tudors are an interesting century. We've had the crown, we've had the Tudors and tromping around with the Six Wives of Henry VIII. And so it has some appeal to people. And I tell them that so many people in the plays, so many characters in the plays have been identified as real people in the court of Queen Elizabeth. And so, but of course, they haven't heard of Lord Burleigh, William Cecil. They should have, but they haven't. Most people, those aren't household names anymore. And, but, I can tell them that, and I said, and Richard III was modeled over on a man whose name was Robert Cecil. And did you know that the person that, and then I have a picture of Oxford and a picture of Cecil on a slide. And I've said, we think Oxford wrote the play, and he modeled Richard III, the most horrific villain he could imagine at the time. Since then, we've had some pretty bad villains in situations. But at any rate, and do you think they knew each other? And I did this to a class not too long ago that I was doing a little talk to. And they said, oh, well, he probably did. I said, well, this man, pointing to Oxford, was married to his sister. And they go, ah. I said, do you think they liked each other very much? No. And so suddenly it just brings it all to life. And it
That's
makes
a great,
that's
Yeah.
you know. So,
Well, I think human beings
fun.
we're interested in other human beings. That's just our social biological nature. So this whole, it doesn't matter who did what, it just goes completely against our human natures. Alex, what you were saying about, in a way, granting some validity to that dumb question, the people I see asking that usually about, oh, what does it matter who wrote them, is they tend to fall into two groups, I think. Stratfordian scholars who are kind of feeling the heat but not ready to commit yet will tend to bring that up, maybe like Marjorie Garber saying in Elizabeth Winkler's book recently, I have no interest in the biography. She just drove Elizabeth crazy by refusing to show any interest in who wrote these things that she's devoted her life to. But I think more interesting are actual people out in the public, like the ones who may have heard something, who just haven't given it much thought. And on the surface, that's a really valid question is, well, what does it matter who wrote them as long as we have them and can enjoy them? Because as you say, Alex, they're good. So, like other things, we can just read them and watch them and enjoy them. We don't know about the lives of the people who do the comic strips we read every day, or the books or TV shows or music. So, but we enjoy it. So why can't we do the same with Shakespeare? And in a way that's valid and it makes sense. But then it goes to the next step of, okay, so just because we can live life at the most shallow level possible, should we?
Right.
and
what are you really enjoying, Jonathan? Are you enjoying the pretty stories like is written up in a children's Shakespeare, for example, which is my first introduction, which is with illustrations and here's the story of Macbeth and here's the story of Romeo and Juliet, and it's words on a page that tell a story. Why is it that the language is important? Why are the words important? Why are the jokes important? Why are the historical references important? If you can just read the children's version.
I think we need heroes. I think people, in addition to needing masterpieces, which show, the kind of apex of human achievement that's possible. I think that just as Edward de Vere and, his generation were so influenced by, Plutarch's Lives, or, the American founding was so inspired by Plutarch's Lives. I think that there is meaning in being able to look at somebody who lived an extraordinary life and to ask, how did they get there? You know what I mean? Like even the idea of that the education and the erudition and the knowledge of many foreign languages and being widely read that would have to go into the creation of these works, I think is important. I think also someplace that this Shakespeare authorship question exists in our current climate is this idea of expertise. I think that's another reason why it's a very hot topic, or why people have kind of differing reactions to it, is this idea of, obviously like the credibility of the universities or the expertise is this, I think, is a big question that society in general is grappling with. And so it adds another layer of, I think, danger and anxiety to overturning and having sort of a paradigm shift, or I guess I would say revolution. We talk about a paradigm shift, but I think there's another layer at which it's when there's an expert class of, the people who are perceived to be the experts about Shakespeare, and for them to be overturned is destabilizing and provocative on a lot of levels, which I think is another thing that gets added into the mix of why does the Shakespeare authorship question matter. And I think a lot, honestly, one of my favorite kind of ways of talking to people about the Shakespeare authorship question is this idea of like, okay, imagine a world where there's all these new types of technologies that are like allow you to be more social and connect through the media. And the government and former morality authorities don't know how to do it. And the country feels fractious, and there's sort of an elderly incumbent, and it feels like there's the potential of a lot of civil discord. And I'm like, I'm talking about the Elizabethan period. I'm talking about the impact of the Gutenberg's printing press and the popular stage overturning and supplanting. I know, it's like,
that's
great.
It's like, yeah.
Like, even like leading up to the last section where there was so much anxiety, kind of this idea of Elizabeth on the throne, what's happening, who are we? And everybody's, hand wringing over, it's not about Twitter or AI or misinformation. It's about, oh my God, it used to just be, you'd go to church and then the preacher would talk about the Bible. Now you can anonymously write a pamphlet, just like you can anonymously post on the internet, and suddenly all hell's broken loose and people are stressed about it. And I think it really mirrors our time, where there's this explosion of communication and social media and art and anonymity, and the expert class is being totally overthrown. And so that, to me, is a way in which the anxiety of that moment and the political instability really mirrors our own, and maybe provides a pathway through it.
I really like that a lot. But here's a question I get asked a lot by my historian husband. Mm-hmm. Why are the English departments the experts? Doesn't that expertise belong in the history department?
Yes, I'm glad you said that, because I've been told too, oh, well, the English professors are the people in authority. No, they're not. They just don't know any history. Ask them who Lord Burleigh is and see how many know that. Ask them the year that Queen Elizabeth died and see if they know that. See if they even know that Queen Elizabeth's mother was Anne Boleyn and her father was Henry VIII. And see if they don't know very much. And also, I think there are two problems when you're trying to get to entice someone's attention in this. One is it does take some mental effort for people to get into this, and people are unfortunately not necessarily dumb, but they're mentally, and I've heard this word, I ran into this. I was listening to a podcast and somebody who I won't say whose name it was accosted by one of his audience that he was telling about the Oxford thing. And she really fussed at him for being a snob and this or that. And he told her to her face on the podcast, "You're mentally lazy." And she was so taken aback. She almost started to cry on the spot. Unfortunate. They should have been a little bit kinder, gentler way to handle that. But one is we do run into that. So we do need to have the best, most gentle approach that we possibly can. And then secondly, it's a defense mechanism that people say, well, it doesn't matter, which is, it's a little bit of a limited hangout. And you'll see people who do really, it should matter, who are teaching English, and they'll say, well, I don't care. Or historians love to say, it's not my century. I've tried to get it. So,
but you're right. The other thing is, these works are not easy to understand unless you dumb them down.
They take work.
Yeah. They take a lot of work. And so I want to focus back on that. You're just being lazy. One thing about knowing who the author is that with a little bit of work, all of a sudden, you don't have to work so hard to understand what's going on.
Yeah.
Perhaps a lot of the full stop, I don't want to know, I don't care, I don't need to know, is either because it's too difficult, like I just don't want to work that hard, or the person secretly knows that something doesn't fit.
Yes.
And they don't want to either consciously realize that. I know all of us have had this happen. It happened to me last week after I finished a lecture on Elizabeth Trentham to a live audience here in the DC area. And a lawyer I didn't know came up to me afterwards and said these words, we've all heard them. I've been duped my entire life. I was an English major. This is this guy, right? I was an English major. And I never heard this before. Why?
Yeah.
I've also thought that to some extent it's a default position and it's an interim position, because some people, now not necessarily everybody, but there are people who should know or in a position to know a little bit more about it. And when they say it doesn't matter, that's there, as I said, I'm going back this again, a defense mechanism, but it's an interim position that, because if they really thought that it didn't matter, or they thought they had a case, they know they don't have a case when they say that. Because if they thought they had a case,
So,
they'd be presenting their case and not saying it doesn't matter.
so those would be, like I alluded to earlier, the strats maybe who are kind of on the fence about it, not willing to take the leap, but keeping a leg in each world. One thing that comes up is, get back to, it is valid on a certain level to say, what does it matter? I can enjoy it. But if you want to go deeper, which you expect universities to do, definitely, isn't knowledge always more valuable? And like people bring up the case of, well, we don't know who wrote Beowulf or some ancient Greek play. Well, yeah, so it's better to have it, not know who did it, than to not have it at all. But you go, we're not talking about somebody thousands of years ago. We're talking about someone 400 years ago. And, if they had a chance to find out who wrote Beowulf, would scholars just go, oh, well,
Oh, they go crazy.
No, they'd leap at it.
Oh my God, of course.
Because that's one question that I always ask when this comes up is, what does it matter who wrote them? Because this is something I learned in my training as a psychotherapist. It's called going meta. And it's like you take a step back, and instead of getting sucked into the arguments, which, the rabid Stratfordians love to suck you into arguments on details and things, you sort of look on the interaction from on high and comment on the tactics that are going on, or the strategies, or the conversation. And I always just pull back and say, who else do they ask this about?
Nobody else.
No one. Once you had brought up Dorothea, do they ask that about
Emily Dickinson?
Emily Dickinson. Did I say, oh, it doesn't matter as long as
her beautiful, clear little lines that are so simplistic and so bottomlessly deep.
Do they ask that about her?
She lived in Amherst, Massachusetts her entire life, and apart from her house and the next door and her garden, she went nowhere. Why is that important to understanding the poetry of Emily Dickinson? If she were a dancer on the stage, Rockettes in New York, and she wrote that poetry, poetry would mean an entirely different thing than a woman from her century and her time, with her education and her choice to live almost a nun-like existence within her own family.
Nobody asked that about Emily Dickinson. They don't ask it about anyone except Shakespeare. So, as I've said, that's proof and validity of the validity of the authorship question, that they have to change the rules for Shakespeare and Shakespeare alone.
Yeah.
The rules that apply to every other creative person don't apply in his case for some reason that we're not supposed to ask about. No, you're a bunch of snobs.
I think it's interesting in general. Like I'm still mulling over what Alex said, which I thought he brought some interesting points up about, just this idea of aesthetics and how universal is art, which, I mean, there's definitely a level on which that's the case. We're talking about Beowulf, and in the same conversation that we're talking about Shakespeare, which points to the idea that there's something about aesthetics and storytelling and the hero's journey and poetry that's universal cross-culturally. But I also think that if you look at satire ages very poorly, and something like political satire, like if you have somebody sit down and watch a bunch of Saturday Night Live episodes from the 1970s, if they're young and they weren't there and they don't know the political figures or the pop cultural figures that are being spoofed, it's really inaccessible. And I feel like that's often the case. Like if you're a kid in school reading The Merchant of Venice, besides not understanding, and I thought this was a good point that Jen's put in the thing of like, is this anti-Semitic, or was he responding to Christopher Marlowe's The Jew and actually portraying a very humanized, less anti-Semitic version of who Jews were on stage is interesting context, but also like the second scene where they're going through all the different suitors of, and they're making fun of like, Monsieur Le Bon, and it's like this long scene. And I remember being a kid in school not getting the joke. You know what I mean? You can feel that there's like a like you can, but it's like if somebody's trying to watch like, famous Oxfordian Charlie Chaplin or whatever, The Great Dictator, and you don't understand that it came out in 1940 and he's spoofing Hitler, you're missing something. You know what I mean? So like comedy in general is something that ages very poorly. I think why when you look at a canon of, more than 30 plays, the number that most most people even have any type of cultural awareness touching on is, you know, you can count them on one hand. Romeo and Juliet, Hamlet, which we know is very informed by, you know, understanding Oxfordianism helps a lot. And, you know, I guess whatever, you know, Merchant of Venice, because it's, or, you know, like it's a very short list of the ones that actually feel universal. I think Rima did you know, like when you look at, for example, Love's Labor's Lost, and then you understand, oh, you know, I guess we just had that episode as well as what Elizabeth brought to it. I think that there's many of these plays are not getting produced as often as they would. You know, sometimes I'll say like, you know, the play isn't the problem. The Stratfordianism is the problem. You know what I mean? Like if you look at Troilus and Cressida and you understand that it's, you know, about Anne Vavasor and Edward de Vere being banished from court and he's trying to suck up to Queen Elizabeth. And it's in a sense supposed to portray Cressida as being, you know, flaky and, you know, untrue. And then that's part of why it seems choppy and jarring to a modern reader. Yeah, I think it's in whether or not art and what types of art are universal and what is education? What is the purpose of education? And, you know, even aesthetically, like the fact that like I remember reading that like people who were they were being tortured, like sometimes like they would torture terrorists by playing music in other cultures. Like if it was like an Islamic person terrorist who was being interrogated, they would put him in a room with like Bruce Springsteen for hours and hours and hours, and it like reads as torture. And so I think even the way that we grow up and the music that we're exposed to, I think that I think Edward de Vere would have said you have to be educated. Philip Sidney would have said you have to be educated in order to appreciate certainly the art that they were putting out, which was supposed to be a showpiece for erudition and being an educated elite.
What's that saying somebody just said among our group? Is what knowledge is good or something?
Right. Yeah.
There we go.
Animal House. What would Animal Farm say?
Animal House. Yeah, but I mean, thinking about going to see contemporary art, really contemporary art in a gallery, and you kind of look at it and you go, oh, a gray on gray, or oh, Mondrian, right? It's got some lines and some squares. I mean, one just sold for 41 million, I think 47 million. Why? You know, why is somebody interested in this square that's got squares inside of it? They're not just going to put it on their wall, right? They're going to understand who this Dutch painter was and, you know, why he painted this way and what he was trying. It's like that. Modern art needs context because otherwise sometimes you have no idea that it's a drama that's being played out in a sculpture. I mean, it simply, you walk past it and you go, oh, I don't understand it.
Yeah.
I'm too lazy, Bonner. I'm too lazy to try to understand. I don't want to work that hard. I just want to read the children's version.
I did, talking of comedy and satire, I did a video on this a couple of years ago with some funny little skits on why does it matter? And I represented like talking to the director of an art museum, who is actually a actress friend of mine, improvising very well, playing a museum art director. I was like, why don't you just take all the credits off of all the artworks? Because what does it matter who did them as long as we
matter who did them, right?
And he was like, that's stupid. And why don't you just take out down all the biographical information? Because how can that add to our enjoyment of the works? She's like, that's stupid. And then I had other people, like a friend of mine, dignified older man, playing a conductor. Maestro, what's your favorite symphonic work? Oh, the Ode to Joy, the Ninth Symphony. Who's that by again? I don't know, some guy, I guess. People don't do that. This only comes up about Shakespeare. And
it's a walk around, right? It's a walk around. The other thing I think and we've talked about this on other episodes, this sense of I understood it when I understood it. It came from this middle-class guy who's just like me, who pulled himself up by his bootstraps, who holds the national identity of the British Isles in his hands. And if we destroy it, we destroy everything that holds us together. You know, it's the national identity. It's the theory that we want it to be someone like us. Yeah.
And that goes to the double standards too, because to Stratfordians, it matters a lot who wrote it, as long as they can find clues that look like their guy.
There aren't a lot of them.
Yeah, so that's why they sort of have to
It's
retreat.
a short list.
One sec, folks. Sorry, I got to grab my computer charger. Apologies.
Okay. Run
Oh,
away,
no.
Vicky, run away.
Oh, no.
Well, you know,
Alex, any more?
No.
Alex,
another
Alex.
more specific reason why why it matters in the Shakespeare case, not only do you have the wrong man, but also you've got in most cases, you've got the wrong dates, because the Stratfordian timeline for creation of the plays has to fit with Shakespeare's life, which means you're talking roughly early 1590s to 1611, let's say, roughly speaking. Whereas the Oxfordian timeline puts the works back on the average about 20 years, from the 1570s up to 1604, and that further has ramifications on who influenced who.
Oh, absolutely. Because,
for example, John Lilly is considered a major influence on Shakespeare under the Stratfordian paradigm because his Euphues novels were published in the year around 1580 or 1579, whatever it is. Anyway, he's considered because he wrote before Shakespeare did. He's considered an influence, whereas the truth would be the other way. That Oxford was probably a major influence on John Lilly, and the same with many other playwrights of the time. It's not that Shakespeare was influenced by them, but rather the opposite in most cases.
Somebody brings up a good point here, saying biographical notes may be included to satisfy viewers' curiosity, not to help us appreciate the works as such. But that brings up the next step question is, why are we curious anyway? And she suggests because of the need for human connectedness. And I think that's what I brought up before is people, we're social animals. We're interested in what other people are doing in other people's lives and minds and things. That's just our nature, I think.
Yeah. It's funny. I will say this. I think that there is actually, we're in this very weird, toxic cultural moment where, and I'm not even talking about, like, I remember when jukebox musicals started getting really hot on Broadway, and this idea that it was going to be like, you would go and see like the Carole King musical, and it would be people who were just kind of humming along to the Carole King tunes. And it was almost like the moral of the story was like, wow, Carole King was even greater and overcame so much. And there was almost like this sort of hagiography that was, but I think in the case of, that's when you have already an affection or a familiarity with the art already. And then you want to go and see like a biopic of the artist. And you're like, wow, I never knew, like, I like that pop hit song, but who knew it was like that person was overcame so much. But I have a discomfort with. There's something about that feels really cheap and like low hanging fruit. And then I also think that somehow there's something that even makes me feel more unsettled about this idea that like the great work of Shakespeare, like this idea that, oh, I understand it because I saw like Hamnet, the play, they're putting up the play of Hamnet. You know what I mean? It's like, I don't know anything about Shakespeare, but I can have some very sentimentalized story of who the author was. And then that replaces actual engagement with like the masterwork. And I was actually thinking, Dorothea, when you were talking about the kind of like the children's version of it, which is interesting. Like this is a big confession. I'd never read Proust. And then I saw that there was somebody was making graphic novels that were sensational, that were sort of abridged versions of like
way, right?
In Search of Lost Time. And I read it and I was like, wow, fabulous. And they referred to it as sort of like, but it's like a little bit of a guilty pleasure because it's like a little bit less, but they referred to it as like a piano reduction of an orchestral composition, which made me think of, there's a famous William F. Buckley Jr. wrote an article for the New York Times in 1986 called "I'm lapidary but not eristic when I use big words." And I always thought that was a really interesting article that speaks to, because he was basically saying, people always say, why do you use these big words? I don't know what they mean. What are you doing? And then he says, well, if I was writing a manual on how to save people from snake bites, I would use small, accessible language to everyone. However, if I'm trying to expand human thought and reach kind of for the stars, it's like asking somebody who's a trained jazz musician to not use the 11th over the whatever, and then suddenly everything kind of gets dumbed down. And so but unfortunately, I think that also introduces another troubling question, which is all culture for everybody? Is there an idea, in America in particular, we have this idea that culture is for everyone and, art is universal and we love it. But then it's like, is there a sense of like words that maybe are people who don't have time to, people who work in specialized fields of knowledge who would have access to kind of similar to like the Renaissance paradigm of creating art, which is another kind of troubling, difficult question of who is art and what
I'm going to leap in here just because we're getting floods of good comments here, so that we keep whizzing by and I say, oh, I need to get to that one, and suddenly we're 50 down again. So I want to bring up a few that have caught my attention. Is going to really basic C.S. Wilson. My experience is that people think it doesn't matter because they don't know enough about Shakespeare's writings. Mm-hmm. Very basic, I think. Shakespeare's body of work isn't taught as much as it used to be. Since they don't know much about Shakespeare, they can't understand why the authorship matters.
But that's also because the story of Shakespeare that they've been getting doesn't really have, I mean, it's fluff, right? It's dumbed down itself.
That goes to another comment here that somebody had. How is it possible for a great work of literature to be written by a person with no comparable life story? If there's no connect between the work and that, why should it matter?
That was my initial thought. That was the very first thought I had when I first started probing or thinking about this question. That was it for me. The life doesn't match the work.
Way back,
Michelle,
Ralph Waldo Emerson,
Honor.
In the middle of the 1800s, Ralph Waldo Emerson said, "The life and the work do not marry." And it was, of course, the little group of American writers who Nathaniel Hawthorne communicated with Delia Bacon. They were catching on, and Walt Whitman understood that that he could understand social injustice and social justice back then, and he understood that there was a problem, and that's going to get us onto another philosophical thing, which is good to get back to. But I want to give y'all something quantitative as to why it matters with a few numbers.
Okay, Honor, you go.
Well, there's a very famous quote that we all know. And I'd forgotten that the Declaration of Reasonable Doubt picks up on this. It's a quote from, and when Mark Rylance, I tuned into the Trust, Shakespeare Trust in England, and Mark Rylance read it on Sunday, and I had just forgotten that this was in it. A wonderful quote from Hugh Trevor Roper. Now, we all know who Hugh Trevor Roper is, the great Oxford historian, one of the greatest of the 20th century, highly, highly respected. And he wrote an essay at one point. And of course, all of us know it well. If people are fairly new to the Oxford thing, they may not have run across it yet. But what Trevor Roper said is that the Stratford Shakespeare has been subjected to the greatest battery of organized research that has ever been directed upon a single person. He goes on to say that armies of scholars, formidably equipped, and all of you know these words, have examined all of the documents which could possibly contain at least a mention of Shakespeare's name. 1/100th of this labor applied to one of his insignificant contemporaries would be sufficient to produce a substantial biography. But the problem is, if it didn't matter, why are all these people, armies of scholars, formidably equipped, Charlotte spent 7 years of her life going through millions of documents. The Wallaces went through at the PRI at the early part of the 20th century. They claim they read through 3 million documents. Why are people spending these great swaths of their life ransacking archives to look for anything that might support what they think is true?
One of two reasons.
Okay.
One of two reasons, and they're both very cynical, so forgive me. Sometimes I can't help myself. One is that they are so desperate for information that anything that could possibly locate, that they could add one more brick, they would be blown away. It would be so magnificent. It would be so important. And that reflects on the second, more even cynical answer, which is it's for their own importance.
Well, that's a thought. But there are a lot of people who would be important. And yes, they would be. If anybody found something substantive about, they would be, they could go to Harvard or Oxford or Cambridge, be carried around on everybody's shoulders and have all kinds of adulation, yes, they certainly would be. It would
And
get,
suddenly it wouldn't matter a lot who wrote that.
it's, yes, okay, good point.
So moving into the modern day, I have two questions that relate to AI, and I'm really curious about what you all think, and maybe some folks who are listening in want to chime in. So the big fuss in publishing and in writing for writers today is this whole question of authenticity, of authorship, and of author's voice because of AI. So as that matters, and it matters a very great deal, whether it's an actual person who has written, we'll just say a novel of historical fiction that's submitted to a publishing company. Why does it matter? If you can say to AI, "Dear AI, please write me a new play in Shakespeare's voice. It should have between 10 and 20 characters. Make sure there's a royal one, a couple dukes, a princess who thinks she's somebody else's daughter, but she's really a princess, a couple of clowns. There needs to be a fight with swords. There needs to be a woman who solves the problem, but she needs to dress like a man in order to solve it. I want it to be a comedy, so it should be a happy ending, and it should have Shakespeare's beautiful language in it." Pop.
Crazy.
Why not just do that? If it doesn't matter, why not just let AI write the next great Shakespeare play?
That's so interesting. I mean, I'm thinking about like the advent of cinema and the camera, and then how, Picasso, went from Raphael to Picasso really fast, and like these sort of like these kind of shifts in valorization over what was valuing in the art that was being created when technology started to exist that could do a better painting than, Picasso could do, in terms of realism. I hate to say it. Part of me is interested in reading that play. Like I like it when AI writes beautiful, like I'm still in the phase where I'm intrigued and tickled and fascinated and afraid. And it feels like they're almost like an angel, like a being of light, where it's just an expert in everything and it kind of pops it out and it just changes how I think about everything. And I almost wonder if like in the future, the way that there used to be sort of much, I mean, I guess there still is like a hierarchy of the types of art where it would be like Chaucer would say, it used to be low status in like the medieval world to sign something as yourself. You know what I mean? Like I think maybe like, you would say, oh, this is like a translation or something, or this is an ancient story, or I didn't just come up with it, because if you just came up with it, it would be considered to be low status. Whereas maybe that'll be a revert, or, just the idea of like a heroic ode. This was another shift that happened. Like Michael Drayton, who I did the paper on in the conference, his big thing was writing these kind of epic historical odes. And then by the end of his life, those weren't in fashion anymore. You know what I mean? Just like today, like, it was like, if you see a movie from the 1959 and it's like, Yul Brynner is Solomon from, the Temple of Solomon. And then nowadays that feels a little grandiose, like the way that maybe authorship as a thing becomes valorized, or the difference, we'll start to have a hierarchical valuing system that will help us to sort through like, this is sort of AI. And so it's going to be evaluated on a certain metric versus something made by people versus something historical or a blend. Like, I think we might have to just start categorizing things to make sense of this, because it's so overwhelming.
I was sort of thrown off by AI the other day, because most of it, I don't care listening to music, but somebody played, here are some Beatles songs as if the Andrews sisters did them in the 40s. And they were really good.
Yeah.
Like, I want to hate this, but I'm enjoying these. And, I've had some back and forths with people saying, oh, listen to this AI song I wrote. And I go, you didn't write it. You entered a prompt.
Yeah.
And somebody else said, maybe we need a new Grammy category of best AI prompt.
But Jonathan, isn't that the very question we're looking at here? But you didn't write it. But Will from Stratford didn't write it. Isn't there at the bottom of this, for some people, a sense
of
justice?
And that in that discussion, somebody actually came up with that same thing we brought up earlier, the very shallow interpretation. Somebody said, oh, you elitists are getting into this, but for us average people, we don't care about all that. We just enjoy the final product. And I'm like, oh, yeah, but at the same time, if I was looking at my book recently on Albrecht Dürer, who I think is one of the greatest draftsmen ever, looking at the years of work he put into drawing so delicately and subtly. So I look at that, one of his drawings, and then I look at maybe an AI prompt of draw a cow in Albrecht Dürer style. Pop, there it is. And you go, oh yeah, it could look a lot like his, but it doesn't have his whole history behind it. All that human interest stuff that one of our commenters alluded to. So it's you can be torn on this. It might still be a good picture, but it doesn't have his history behind it.
Here's another question. Do you trust what Edward de Vere wrote about a court scene in a play? Let's just take the abdication scene. Do you trust his view, thinking he wrote the abdication scene in Richard II more or less than if you think Will of Stratford wrote it? Here is a king holding up the crown, right? And handing, I can't quite hand it over. Whose version do you trust more of that human emotion as the will tugs back and forth? And yes, the pun, I know, I'm sorry.
To me, that goes back to another thing I bring up to people who say, well, what does it matter who did this? And it goes into reading the plays and understanding them or producing them. If you put them on stage, like, for example, A Midsummer Night's Dream, does it matter that one authorship candidate is known to have traveled within 25 miles of a town in Italy called Little Athens, where there was a church called the Temple and a city gate called the Duke's Oak? Maybe everyone for centuries has been misreading that and picturing a big tree, and that's not what was intended. Maybe if you're designing it, if you know about Edward de Vere, you can put a city gate there, which makes more sense than a big tree. Or, for example, Hamlet, where he says, I'm set naked in your kingdom, and everyone interprets it as him saying he's vulnerable. But then you find out one authorship candidate literally was set naked on the beach by pirates. So maybe we've been producing the play wrong all these years, and in the next scene you need to have Hamlet come in a barrel or holding a shrubbery around him or something, and maybe that's what was intended. So it goes into who wrote it, depends on whether you get the interpretation right, maybe. And that's pretty important, I think.
Yes.
So, that reminds me, people have asked me, as an actor, would the authorship question play into how you played a character if you were in one of these plays? And I would say, to be honest, I'd say what Derek Jacobi said is, no, not as an actor. I'm just doing what's in the script. As a director and maybe a designer, definitely it could affect it in your interpretation of what you emphasize and don't emphasize.
So but you don't think that, you would not play a role in a Shakespeare play differently? That actually might be an interesting exercise. Take a soliloquy, Macbeth's out, brief candle. Try it with a different author. Try it with Will of Stratford. Yeah. Try it with Edward de Vere. What's the difference?
Yeah, for me, it would go more toward you play the character of the author, whoever it is wants in that story at that moment. And, it's the integrity of the work. I'm sure in some cases it might, but if I'm playing a scene with Malvolio and thinking, oh, it's so-and-so in the court, it doesn't really play into it. I'm playing it with Malvolio. But as a director, it might be really interesting to have the other actor look like Philip Sidney or something like that. Yeah, but it goes back to what does it matter? You mean there's no difference between one authorship candidate having been there in Italy, seeing these things, and the other guy getting it at the Mermaid Tavern? There's no difference between those. They're equal. I don't get it. We're kind of preaching to the converted here because this whole question, nobody here, I'm sure, believes it. Or,
Well,
but
I
it
don't
gives
know.
us.
Just got comment bombed by a pretty
Go.
ardent Thomas North fan, which is interesting. You know what I mean? Like we're like just this. I guess it comes back just the kind of epistemic question of like, what is the truth? And I mean, we got a good question of, you know, when people say, how do you respond when people say it's a conspiracy theory?
Yes,
What's your response? I guess my honest answer is, I mean, there are things that I would say, and I feel very uncomfortable. I don't like, it makes me feel uncomfortable. Like, on the one hand, I have like a rebellious side where I'm like, oh, it's cool to get to be, you know, but it feels, I understand like when people, like it seems improbable, like in terms of my YouTube, like TikTok videos or something, very often people will be very scathing and dismissive and nasty if they see a short video that's just me and it's out of context. Like, of course, they're going to see like some chick on the internet saying stuff. And I understand why there's like I think there's a biologically healthy mechanism, which rejects that, you know what I mean? Like, cause then it just, again, like that Tower of Babel thing. Like, I think it's awkward for me that like the mainstream, everything that everyone's been taught is just wrong. Like, I find it deeply troubling. And, I mean, I guess in a sense it is a conspiracy theory, right? Like it is, right? That Edward de Vere, and that there was an intentional kind of plot to erase him from the records, and it is a secret that's been kept by numerous people. Like it is kind of a conspiracy theory. And you know, what else in our lives, you know, kind of operates under the same rules. So I always find myself, it's like an inconvenient truth is honestly how I feel about it. You know what I mean? Like it is very destabilizing and it is weird. And I like the idea of the Stratford man who came from nothing and was this incredible self-made guy. Like all of the
appealing. Yeah.
It's very appealing. Like it's like sometimes it's like, yeah, I don't know, the costs. I think the costs of accepting it and recognizing the massive amounts of ignorance, the massive amounts of cover up and the historical mistakes and stuff, all of it. I'm like, if there are people who don't want to like grapple with that, I understand why, because I find it really disturbing is the word I keep coming back to all the time.
Well, I think that also years ago, for 2014, I think the Folger was open enough to discussion to hold a huge 3-day conference on the authorship question. And one of the most interesting conclusions to come out of it after people, and I'm sure some of them who are listening to this now or who will listen to it were there as well as I was, but that there is a sizable number of people who just like not knowing and continuing to fiddle with the puzzle as if it is a Rubik's Cube that they can't solve, that they're not actually trying to solve the Rubik's Cube. They just like the mechanism and the sound of turning the pieces. So
Yeah.
the continuing to dig and dig and turn and turn and turn these issues is the pleasure, because they hope it never will be solved so that they can continue to work on it. And I found
right,
that
and to become
fascinating,
as you said,
fascinating look.
The idea of like, I'm the one who's discovered, I think that's very addictive. And I think that even amongst us in our community of scholars, I think that when we're hard-headed, I think everybody wants to be the one that catches the thing that nobody else got. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah, sure.
And I think there is this
competition's good.
Competition's totally good. One of my favorite novels is Umberto Eco, Foucault's Pendulum, and it's about this kind of young, kind of arrogant group of, I guess, like PhD students who get a summer job working at like a woo-woo bookshop. And so they come up with this idea that they're going to write a book that's all about like the Knights Templar and kind of make like the super ultra mega conspiracy theory of all time. And then what ends up happening is, I mean, all hell breaks loose. They accidentally they get these like obsessive acolytes who think that they do know the secret, who like kidnap them and try and get them to divulge the secret of where like the Knights Templar hid all this stuff. They themselves begin to go mad and sort of have this overwhelming pareidolia and think that they know all this stuff. It just, I don't know. I think that I think when Edward de Vere, said nothing is truer than truth, I think that can be seen as a simplistic, I mean, it can be seen as a tautology, right? It can be seen as the dumbest thing that anyone ever said, or it's like the most profound, deepest, most complex thing to wrestle with ever. Does everyone need to know the truth? What is truth? What kind of truth? Whose truth? I mean, this question of what is truth is overwhelming.
Alex, did you have a thought?
Yeah, I just wanted to point out, there's a great comment I saw when we were talking about conspiracy theories. Somebody posted one. The real conspiracy was the one that set up William Shakespeare of Stratford as the author.
Oh yeah.
Tom Woosnam used to say that a lot.
Yeah,
And
that's
would
the
spell out how
conspiracy.
that was a conspiracy.
Yeah.
And a comment,
Not us.
a comment I read in, we'll say it's, I believe it's in Joseph Sobrand's book. That is an answer to that. He says it's not a matter of conspiracy. It's a matter of history, sociology, and deliberate policy on the part of people in positions of power.
Politics, politics, politics. Yep.
And
Yep.
I totally subscribe to that. That's what it's been.
Any final thoughts, anyone? It's our closing time has come.
Our closing time is here. Yeah. So I guess, maybe one final circular argument. Why, if it doesn't matter, does everybody talk about it?
That's going super meta there.
Yeah, super meta.
Everyone.
Well, but everybody has an opinion on it, right? It doesn't matter. It has to be Will. It can't be anybody else. Or, it's any number of authorship candidates, and people get very, very excited and very passionate about it when they have an opinion. So if it doesn't matter, why all the passion?
And again, who else do they ask that question about?
Well, so
when you have to make an exception for Shakespeare and Shakespeare alone, yet again, to the rules that apply to any other human being, that means it means it matters, right? We've got so many questions we didn't get to, or comments, and there were so many good ones. Thank you, everyone, so much for this and for this engaged discussion. I hope you got something from reading each other's comments there. Again, thanks to all our usual regulars live here in the Blue Boar Tavern. Until next month, thanks, everyone.